The air inside the rehearsal hall always felt heavy, thick with the scent of floor wax and old wood. For most people, this smell was just a background detail, something they ignored while they tuned their instruments or chatted about their weekends. But for the young woman sitting at the grand piano in the center of the room, this smell was everything. It was her map. It told her exactly where she was, how high the ceilings were, and how much space she had to move in. Since the day she was born, her world had been painted in shades of darkness, a complete and total absence of light. She didn't know what the color blue looked like, and she didn't know what a sunset looked like. She only knew the world through what she could touch, what she could smell, and most importantly, what she could hear. She sat on the bench, her posture straight and tall. To the others in the room, she looked small and fragile. She was thin, with pale skin that seemed to never see the sun. Her eyes were hidden behind a pair of dark, thick glasses, which made it hard for anyone to make eye contact with her. When she walked, she used a white cane that tapped rhythmically against the floor, sounding out a path that her eyes could not show her. People often treated her like she was made of glass. They spoke to her in soft, careful voices, as if she might break if they were too loud. They would offer to guide her elbow to open a simple gate, or they would hover nearby, waiting to catch her if she stumbled. It was annoying, but she had learned to accept it with a polite nod. They saw the blindness first, and the person second. Today, however, she wasn't there to be helped. She was there to work. The rehearsal was for a big concert coming up at the end of the month. It was a major event, the kind that could make or change a musician's career. The conductor, a man with a booming voice and very little patience, had been skeptical about hiring her. He had seen many musicians play with perfect technique, but he was looking for something deeper. He wanted emotion. He wanted the audience to feel the music in their chests. He stood a few feet away from the piano, his arms crossed, watching her closely. He didn't say anything, but she could feel his presence. The air shifted slightly when he moved, the sound of his shoes squeaking on the polished floor, cutting to the quiet murmur of the orchestra warming up. She reached out and let her fingers hover over the keys. She hadn't pressed them down yet. She was just getting the lay of the land. The piano was a stranger to her, and she needed to introduce herself before she could trust it with her music. Her fingers danced lightly over the ivory, feeling the small scratches and the wear of years of use. The keys told a story. The middle C felt slightly worn down, probably from thousands of students practicing their scales. The higher keys felt sharper, cooler to the touch. She didn't need to see the black and white pattern to know where they were. Her hands knew the distance instinctively. It was like reading a book in Braille. But instead of dots, she was reading vibrations and textures. To the casual observer, it looked like she was just stalling. Some of the violinists in the back exchanged glances, whispering to each other. They were wondering if she was nervous. They were wondering if a blind person could really handle the complex piece they were about to play. The music was difficult. It required perfect timing, intense speed, and a deep understanding of mood. It wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about understanding the space between the notes. The conductor shifted his weight, letting out a loud sigh that echoed in the hall. He was a man who valued efficiency, and he didn't like waiting. She ignored the sigh. She blocked out the whispers. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty air of the hall. For a moment, she let her mind drift away from the people watching her. She thought about the way the sound traveled in this room. It was a large space, much bigger than the small practice room she was used to. The sound would bounce off the walls, hanging in the air for a long time before fading away. This meant she had to be careful with the pedal. She had to be precise. If she held the sustain pedal down too long, the music would become a muddy mess. If she didn't hold it enough, the sound would be too dry, too choppy. It was a delicate balance, a tightrope walk that required her full attention. She flexed her fingers, feeling the tension in her joints. She was nervous. Of course she was. It was impossible not to be. But her fear wasn't about playing the wrong notes. Her fear was about connection. How could she make a room full of strangers see the same picture she saw in her head? How could she translate the feeling of a rainy day or the joy of a sunrise into sound without ever seeing those things herself? She relied on metaphors that were unique to her experience. To her, a happy melody didn't look like the sun. It felt like a cat purring against her chest or the warmth of a thick wool blanket. A sad melody didn't look like a gray sky. It felt like the cold bite of a metal railing in winter. The conductor tapped his baton against his music stand. Asterisk tap. 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 Asterisk, the sound was sharp, piercing through her thoughts. It was time. All right, from the top, he called out, his voice commanding. Let's see what this sounds like. She lowered her hands. The silence in the room grew heavy, pressing in on her ears. This was the moment she lived for. This was the moment where the disability faded away, and the music took over. When she played, she wasn't the blind girl anymore. She wasn't the one who needed help crossing the street. She was the storyteller. She was the one in control. The piano waited beneath her fingers, a dormant beast ready to wake up. The audience wasn't there yet, but she could feel the ghost of them. She could feel the pressure of the empty seats, waiting to be filled with people expecting to be entertained. She knew they would look at her and see her lack of sight, but she was determined to make them listen until they forgot. The musicians behind her raised their instruments. The cellists dug their end pins into the floor. The violinists lifted their bows. Everyone was looking at the conductor, waiting for the signal. The conductor raised his arm high. The air in the room seemed to stop moving. The young woman on the bench took one last breath, centering herself, finding that quiet place inside her mind where the sound lived. She wasn't thinking about the technical difficulty anymore. She wasn't thinking about the keys. She was just thinking about the feeling. She was ready to speak the only language she knew without translation. The baton came down and the music began to breathe. The week following the first rehearsal was not kind to her. The piece they were practicing was difficult, not just for the fingers, but for the soul. It was a modern composition, full of jagged edges and strange, jumping rhythms. To most of the orchestra, the sheet music looked like a chaotic mess of black dots dancing on a page, but at least they could see the page. For her, it was a mountain she had to climb without a map. She spent hours in her small apartment, with her braille music sheet spread out across the coffee table, running her fingers over the raised dots until her skin felt raw and sensitive. The main problem wasn't the notes themselves. She had the technique to play anything. The problem was the interpretation. The conductor, a man of old habits and strong opinions, kept stopping the rehearsals to correct her. He would stand in front of the orchestra, waving his arms frantically, try to explain a feeling that she couldn't see. No, 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 he would shout, his voice echoing off the high walls of the hall. It needs to be more azure here. Do you understand? It needs the color of a deep, melancholic sky. She would sit there, frozen on the bench, her hands hovering over the keys. She would bite her lip, feeling a knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. Azure, she would think. What did that even mean? She knew it was a color. She knew it was a shade of blue, but she had never seen blue. She didn't know if blue was soft or hard, warm or cold, jagged or smooth. To her, colors were just words people used to describe things she would never touch. It felt like being locked out of a room where everyone else was having a conversation. She wanted to scream, I don't know what blue looks like. Just tell me how loud to play. But she didn't. She just nodded her head and said, I will try. But trying wasn't working. Every time she played the passage the way she thought it should sound, he would shake his head. Too heavy, he would say. It's floating. It needs to be weightless, like a cloud drifting. Again, the words meant nothing to her. Clouds were water vapor. How did water vapor sound? She tried to play lighter, touching the keys as gently as possible, but then he would say, No, now it has no substance. It needs to be sad. She was going in circles. She was chasing a ghost she couldn't catch. The frustration began to spill over into her life outside the rehearsal hall. She found snapping at her friends when they tried to help her with simple things. She felt constantly on edge, like her skin was too tight for her body. She felt that everyone was judging her, not just on her playing, but on her ability to understand the world. She began to wonder if the conductor was right. Maybe she couldn't play this piece. Maybe a blind person just couldn't understand the visual poetry that the music was supposed to represent. The thought terrified her. Music was the only thing that made her feel equal to everyone else. If she lost that, she didn't know who she was. One afternoon, during a break in the rehearsal. She sat alone on a bench in the hallway, rubbing her temples. She could hear the other musicians talking and laughing nearby, but she felt miles away. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and fast. She quickly wiped it away, angry at herself for crying. Crying wouldn't help her understand the color blue. That was when a woman from the cello section walked over. The cellist was a quiet person, someone who let her instrument do the talking. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat down next to the pianist on the bench. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. The cellist could sense the tension rolling off the younger woman in waves. "He is being very abstract today," the cellist said softly. "He is talking about clouds and colors. It's hard for anyone to understand, honestly." The pianist let out a short, bitter laugh. "It's impossible for me," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "He keeps telling me to play it like it's blue, or like it's floating. I don't know what those things feel like to him. I am just guessing." The cellist thought for a moment. She set her heavy cello case down on the floor with a thud. "Forget the colors," she said. "Forget the clouds. Music isn't really about seeing, anyway. It's about feeling. It's physical." The pianist turned her head slightly, turning her ear toward the cellist. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering with words, the cellist reached out and took the pianist's hand. She placed the pianist's palm flat against her own chest, right over her heart. "Take a breath," the cellist instructed. "Now hold it until it hurts." The pianist did as she was told. She inhaled deeply and held the air in her lungs. Her chest expanded against the cellist's hand. She waited. Seconds ticked by. Her chest began to burn slightly. The need to exhale grew stronger and stronger. It became a pressure, an ache in the center of her body. "Now let it go," the cellist said. The pianist exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to take all the energy out of her body. "That tension," the cellist said, tapping her chest lightly. "That pressure right before you let go. That is what he means by blue. That is the feeling of the melody. It isn't a color in the sky. It is the feeling of holding back a sob. It is a heaviness in your chest when you have bad news, but you can't say it yet." The pianist sat there, stunned. She let the words sink in. A sob, a held breath. She knew those feelings. She knew them intimately. She knew the tightness in the throat that comes with trying not to cry. She knew the release of finally letting the tears fall. Suddenly, the blue melody wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a human experience she had lived 1,000 times. "And the cloud part?" the pianist asked, her voice stronger now. The cellist smiled. "Imagine you are lying in the grass on a warm day," she said. "The sun is on your face. You are weightless. You are sinking into the earth. Your muscles are completely loose. You have nowhere to be and nothing to do. That is the floating part." The pianist closed her eyes behind her dark glasses. She didn't need to imagine the sun in the sky. She knew the feeling of warmth on her skin. She knew the feeling of the ground supporting her back. She knew what it felt like to let go of all her tension. It was a sensation of pure trust. "I can do that," the pianist said, a small smile forming on her lips. "I know those feelings." "Good," the cellist said, picking up her cello case. "Stop trying to paint a picture for him. Just tell the story of your body. Let the music feel like a heartbeat. Let it feel like a breath. That is what people want to hear. They don't want to see a color. They want to feel alive." The break ended, and the musicians filed back into the rehearsal hall. The atmosphere felt different to the pianist as she walked to her place at the piano. The scary, abstract wall that had been blocking her was gone. She sat down on the bench and flexed her fingers. She didn't think about the sky, or the clouds, or the shades of blue. She thought about the ache in her chest. She thought about the relief of letting go. She thought about the physical sensations of being alive. The conductor raised his baton. He looked skeptical, expecting another struggle. From the third measure, he called out, "And remember, it needs to be azure. It needs to float." She took a deep breath, just like she had done in the hallway. She felt the air fill her lungs. She felt the slight burn of holding it. Then she brought her hands down on the keys. The sound that came out was different. It wasn't just notes on a page. It was heavy, dark, and rich. It was the sound of a heart beating under stress. It was the sound of a held breath. As the melody moved upward, she let the tension go, the music becoming lighter, softer, like a long exhale. The conductor lowered his baton. He didn't stop her. He didn't correct her. He stood there, his eyes wide, listening to the transformation. The orchestra stopped playing for a moment, surprised by the sudden shift in the pianist's sound, but they quickly jumped back in, following her lead. They weren't just playing notes anymore. They were following the feeling she was creating. They were breathing with her. For the first time, the pianist wasn't struggling to translate someone else's vision. She was using her own tools, her own feelings, to build the music. The piano ceased to be a machine of wood and wire. It became a giant drum, resonating with the pulse of her emotions. She realized that she didn't need eyes to see the music. She just needed to be honest enough to let her feelings flow through her fingers. The fear that had been gripping her heart all week began to loosen. She wasn't just a blind girl trying to fit in anymore. She was a musician, speaking a language that everyone in the room could understand, a language deeper than words. She was finally telling the truth. The day of the big performance arrived with a strange kind of silence. It was the kind of quiet that exists inside a house just before a big storm hits, where the air feels thick and still, waiting for something to happen. When she woke up that morning, she didn't feel the usual excitement that comes with a special day. Instead, she felt a heavy weight settling in her stomach. It was a familiar feeling, the physical sensation of anxiety that always came before she had to do something difficult in front of other people. For a person who cannot see, public performance is not just about playing music. It is about stepping onto a stage and feeling the weight of 100 or sometimes 1,000 invisible eyes staring at you. It is a feeling of being exposed, of being different. She moved through her morning routine slowly, trying to keep her hands steady. She made breakfast, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. These were the sound of her safe world, her small apartment where everything had its place, and she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. But today, she would have to leave that safety behind. She would have to go out into the chaotic, noisy city and travel to the concert hall. The trip to the venue was harder than usual. The city seemed louder and more aggressive. The traffic roared like a beast, and people pushed past her on the sidewalk without apologizing. Every tap of her cane on the concrete felt like a drumbeat counting down the minutes. She held onto the arm of her driver as they helped her out of the car and guided her toward the stage entrance. The air outside the hall smelled of coal metal and exhaust fumes, a sharp contrast to the warm, dusty smell of the rehearsal room. When they walked inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air in the theater was cool and still, but it was vibrating with energy. Even though the audience hadn't arrived yet, she could feel the presence of the space. It was a large cavern of a room, and the sounds of her footsteps echoed back to her, telling her just how high the ceiling was and how far away the walls were. It was a reminder of how empty the place felt, but also how full it would soon be. Backstage, the noise was overwhelming. It was a maze of corridors and tight spaces filled with people rushing around. Musicians were running scales on their instruments, creating a chaotic soup of sound. A flute trilled here, a violin screeched there, and a double boomed like a heartbeat. She could smell the sharp tang of hairspray and the sweet scent of flowers that were being arranged for the soloists. She could hear the stage crew moving heavy equipment, shouting instructions to one another. It was a sensory storm, and for a moment, she felt completely lost in it. She stood still for a second, closing her eyes behind her glasses, just trying to breathe through the noise. A familiar hand touched her shoulder. It was the cellist, the one who had helped her understand the music during the hard rehearsals. "We are in the tuning room," the cellist said, her voice calm and steady. "Follow me." She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She followed the sound of the cellist's footsteps and the soft shuffle of her clothes. They found a quiet corner away from the hustle. She sat down and ran her fingers over the folds of her long black dress. It was made of silk, smooth and cool to the touch. She had chosen it carefully because it didn't have any scratchy seams or distracting textures. She needed to focus entirely on the piano, and she couldn't have anything irritating her skin. She touched her hair, making sure every strand was in place. She wanted to look professional. She knew that even though she couldn't see the audience, They would be looking at her. They would be judging her appearance before she even played a single note. As the time for the concert drew near, the nervousness in her stomach turned into a cold knot. She started to think about all the things that could go wrong. What if her hands started to sweat and slipped on the keys? What if she lost her place in the complex structure of the music? What if she couldn't find the right pedals? These thoughts spun around in her head, making her feel dizzy. The fear was not logical, but it was powerful. It whispered that she didn't belong there, that a blind girl had no business leading an orchestra. The conductor came into the room to gather the musicians. He didn't say much to her, but he paused in front of her. She could smell his cologne, a spicy, woody scent. She felt the heat of his body close to hers. "Trust yourself," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "Just play the way you did in the last rehearsal. Do not try to do more. Just feel it." She nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. His words helped a little, but they didn't erase the fear completely. Then it was time. The stage manager called the musicians to their places. The sound of the hallway changed as the musicians walked toward the stage. The floor changed from carpeted concrete to wooden planks. The sound of their footsteps became sharper and louder. As they walked out from the darkness of the wings into the brightness of the stage lights, she felt the temperature rise. The stage lights gave off a powerful heat that washed over her face. For a sighted person, these lights might be blinding, but for her, they were just a wall of heat. She couldn't see the audience sitting in the darkness beyond the lights, but she could feel them. She could feel the vast emptiness of the room in front of her, a void that was waiting to be filled. She was guided to the piano bench. She sat down and smoothed her dress behind her. She reached out and found the fallboard of the piano, lowering the lid to expose the keys. The wood felt familiar and grounding. She ran her hands quickly over the keys, silently checking the distance. She adjusted the bench to the perfect height, listening to the squeak of the metal mechanism. She positioned her feet on the pedals, feeling the cold metal against the soles of her shoes. And then the waiting began. The audience was filing in. She couldn't see them, but she could hear them. It was a low, rumbling sound like the ocean. It started as a murmur and grew louder as more people entered the hall. She heard coughs, the rustling of coats, the clicking of seat bottoms being flipped down, and the soft whispers of hundreds of people. Every sound seemed amplified. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. The sheer number of people out there was terrifying. To her, it sounded like an army waiting for a battle. She sat very still, trying to slow down her racing heart. She focused on her breathing. In, out, in, out. She tried to visualize the music in her mind, seeing it as a landscape of feelings rather than notes. She thought about the blue melody, the feeling of holding her breath. She thought about the lightness of the clouds. She tried to push away the image of the hundreds of eyes staring at her. The lights in the hall dimmed. The rumble of the audience faded into a hush. This was the loudest silence she had ever heard. It was a heavy, thick silence that pressed against her ears. It was the sound of expectation. In that moment, she felt incredibly small. She was just one person in a vast, dark space. She was a blind woman alone on a giant stage, with nothing but her hands and her memory to guide her. The fear peaked, shaking her shoulders. But then, she remembered the cellist's hand on her chest. She remembered the feeling of the heartbeat. The music wasn't out there in the dark. It was inside her. It was her own life, her own breath, her own heartbeat. She heard the conductor walk onto the stage. The floorboards creaked under his shoes. The sound came from behind her and slightly to her right. She could feel the vibrations of his steps traveling to the floor and up the legs of the bench. He stepped onto the podium. He raised his baton. The silence stretched out, tight and tense, like a rubber band ready to snap. She took one last deep breath, filling her lungs with the hot, dusty air of the stage. She placed her fingers on the keys, ready to speak. The moment the baton came down, the silence in the hall shattered. It wasn't a gradual start. It was an explosion of sound. The entire orchestra seemed to take a breath and release it all at once, a tidal wave of noise that crashed over the audience. But the young woman at the piano did not flinch. She was ready. Her hands came down on the keys with force that surprised everyone, including the musicians sitting behind her. She didn't just play the notes. She attacked them. The sound was sharp and percussive, cutting through the heavy texture of the strings like a knife. For the first few minutes, her role was to provide a steady, rhythmic foundation. The music was chaotic, representing confusion and noise of the world. Her left hand jumped across the lower keys, creating a dark, driving pulse, while her right hand danced nimbly through the higher registers. She wasn't thinking about the individual notes anymore. She wasn't thinking about the dots on the page. She was thinking about the stress of the week, the anxiety of the travel, and the frustration of trying to understand impossible instructions. She poured all that tension into the keys. The piano became a way to release the pressure that had been building up inside her chest for days. As the chaotic opening section began to settle, the music shifted. The orchestra pulled back, their volume dropping to a whisper, leaving the piano exposed. This was the dangerous part. This was a blue passage the conductor had talked about, the part that needed so much emotion. A lesser musician might have played it safe, keeping the volume steady and the rhythm perfect. But she didn't play it safe. She remembered the cellist's hand on her chest. She remembered the feeling of holding a breath until it hurt. She slowed down. She didn't just play softer. She changed the quality of the sound. She leaned her body weight into the keys, pressing them down deep into the bed of felt and wood. The sound that came out wasn't just a musical tone. It was a vibration that rattled the very floorboards of the stage. It was a sound of deep, aching sadness. It felt like a heavy stone being dropped into a still pool of water. The audience felt it in their stomachs before they even processed it with their ears. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by the sudden gravity of the music. She played a melody with agonizing slowness, letting each note hang in the air until the very last possible second before playing the next one. It was the musical equivalent of holding back tears. She was squeezing the emotion out of every second. Because she couldn't see, she didn't have the luxury of looking at her hands to check her position. She had to trust her muscle memory completely. This allowed her to close her eyes behind her glasses and turn her entire focus inward. She wasn't performing for the crowd. She was reliving her own life. She was playing the loneliness of navigating a world she couldn't see. She was playing the frustration of people underestimating her. She was playing the exhaustion of always having to work twice as hard as everyone else. The acoustics of the hall were perfect for her. The piano sound bloomed outward, filling the vast space. She could hear the sound bouncing off the back walls and return to her ears a fraction of a second later. This echo gave her a sense of the room size that she couldn't get with a cane. She could feel the shape of the darkness around her through the sound. It was like she had built a cathedral out of sound, and she was standing in the center of it. Then came the shift. The heavy, sad melody began to climb. It moved upward, note by note, rising from the depths of the piano into the bright, singing register of the upper treble. This was the transition she had been waiting for. The cloud section. She lifted the heavy weight from her shoulders. Her fingers became light, barely grazing the keys. She changed the pedal, softening the sustain so the notes were clear and distinct, like droplets of water rather than a flowing river. The change in atmosphere was physical. The tension in the concert hall seemed to dissipate. The harsh lines of the music smoothed out. The orchestra followed her lead, the strings playing with a sweet, glassy tone that floated above her delicate accompaniment. It felt like coming up for air after being underwater for a long time. She played with a sense of freedom that was rare to hear. It was a feeling of relief. It was a feeling of a warm day after a long winter. She wasn't hitting the keys anymore. She was caressing them. Because she was blind, her ears were far more sensitive than the average person's. She could hear tiny nuances that other players missed. She heard when the first violins were slightly late, and she adjusted her timing instantly to bring them back into the fold. She heard when bassoons were too loud, and she subtly increased her volume to balance them out. She was acting as the anchor for the entire group. Even though she was sitting in the middle of them, it was a silent, invisible leadership. The conductor didn't need to wave his arms wildly. He just watched her, letting her guide the tempo with her breath and her body language. As the piece moved toward its climax, the tempo began to speed up. The music became intricate and complicated, a weave of rapid notes that required incredible dexterity. Her hands moved in a blur of motion. To the audience, it looked like a magic trick. They couldn't see her reading music. They couldn't see her looking at the conductor. They just saw a young woman, staring straight ahead into nothingness, her hands flying across the keys with impossible speed and accuracy. It was a display of pure talent that defied logic. But for her, it wasn't magic. It was math and physics and feeling. She felt the vibration of the piano strings humming through the keyboard. She felt the resonance of the instrument against the bench. She was in a trance state where her mind was perfectly clear. There was no room for fear or doubt anymore. There was only the music. The music was a living thing that she was holding in her hands, shaping it, molding it, and setting it free. She approached the final, difficult run, a cascade of notes that tumbled down the keyboard like a waterfall. This was the moment where the risk was highest. One slip, one missed finger, and the spell would be broken. She didn't hold back. She threw her hands into the run with total commitment. She hit every note with a crystal-clear precision. The sound was brilliant and shimmering. She drove the tempo faster, pushing the orchestra to keep up with her. The energy in the room skyrocketed. The audience was on the edge of their seats, mesmerized by the sheer power of the sound. With one final massive chord, she brought her hands down hard on the keys and then lifted them high into the air. The sound exploded outward, filling every corner of the vast hall. She pressed the sustain pedal, letting the final chord ring out and fade into silence. She sat there, frozen, her chest heaving, her hands suspended in the air. She could feel the vibration of the piano dying away beneath her fingers. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't empty or expectant. It was full. It was heavy with the ghost of the sound they had just created. She had poured her entire soul into those 20 minutes, and now, sitting in the darkness of the stage, she felt completely empty and completely full at the same time. She had shown them who she was, not by letting them see her, but by forcing them to listen. The final chord did not just stop. It dissolved into the air, fading away like a breath held for too long, and finally released. Inside the great instrument, the strings stopped vibrating, and the felt dampers did their job, silencing the sound until only the ghost of the music remained. The young woman sat there on the bench, her hands still hovering over the keys, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She was covered in a thin sheen of sweat, her body trembling slightly from the immense physical effort of the last 20 minutes. She did not move. She did not stand up to take a bow. In the darkness behind her glasses, she was waiting. For her, the music was still happening in her mind. She was hearing the echoes of the melody bouncing off the distant walls of the hall. To a person who cannot see, silence is never truly empty. It is full of information. She heard the rustle of a program page being turned in the front row. She heard the distinct click of a woman's high heel shifting position on the wooden floor. She heard the collective intake of breath from the hundreds of people sitting in the shadows in front of her. But mostly, she felt the energy. It was a heavy, thick blanket of awe that seemed to press against her skin. The air itself felt different, charged with electricity. In the audience, the reaction was delayed. People were stunned. They had come expecting a technical display, perhaps a curiosity act of a blind musician playing difficult notes. But what they had witnessed was a raw exposure of the human spirit. They had not seen her play the piano. They had felt her bleed emotion into the room. The sightless girl, the one they had viewed with pity or curiosity, had just taken them on a journey more vivid than anything their eyes could show them. They saw their own grief, their own joy, and their own struggles reflected in the sound she made. For those few minutes, the disability had vanished. There was no blind woman and no sighted audience. There was just a shared experience of being alive. Then, a single sound broke the spell. A man in the back row let out a loud, sharp exhale, a whistle of breath that sounded like a signal. That was all it took. Suddenly, the dam broke. A roar of applause erupted, starting as a rumble and growing instantly into a deafening thunder. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a chaotic explosion of appreciation. The sound hit her like a physical wave. It washed over the stage, vibrating the floorboards and the bench she sat on. It took her a moment to realize what the sound was. In the practice rooms, applause was just noise. But here, in this vast space, it felt like the ocean crashing against the shore. She felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with relief. She slowly lowered her hands to her lap, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. She turned her head slightly toward the direction of the sound, a small, genuine smile spreading across her face. It was a smile of someone who has been heard, truly heard, for the first time. The conductor walked onto the stage from behind her, his footsteps heavy and quick. He did not guide her by the arm this time. Instead, he took her hand and gently raised it into the air. This was a signal. She stood up. As she rose, the applause grew even louder, if that was possible. Some people in the audience had stood up, then more stood. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet. It was a standing ovation, a sea of standing people clapping their hands together, cheering, and shouting bravo. She stood there, bathed in the heat of the stage lights, unable to see the hundreds of faces looking at her with tears in their eyes. But she didn't need to see them. She could feel them. She could feel the love and the respect radiating from the darkness. It hit her in the chest, warming her from the inside out. For years, she had felt like she was on the outside looking in, separated by a wall of glass that she could not break through. Tonight, the glass was gone. She had built a bridge with the piano keys, and the world had walked across it to meet her. The orchestra members stood up too, turning their chairs around to face her. They tapped their bows against their music stands or clapped their hands. The cellist, her friend and mentor, was beaming at her from across the stage. The young woman reached out her hand, searching for the edge of the piano to steady herself. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the applause, but for the struggle that got her here, the frustration, the rehearsals, the condescending voices, the fear of failure. All of it was necessary to create this moment. The pain was the fuel that made the music burn so bright. She bowed deeply. It wasn't a formal, stiff bow. It was a bow of humility and grace. She held the position for a moment, listening to the roar, letting the sound wash over her like a cleansing rain. When she straightened up, there were tears running down her cheeks, hidden behind her dark glasses. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. The concert was not over yet. There were more pieces to play and encores to come. But this moment, this specific sliver of time, belonged only to her. The house lights eventually came up, bathing the hall in a warm glow. Usually, this brightness was annoying to her, making her eyes hurt behind the glasses. But tonight, she didn't mind. It felt like the sun coming out after a long storm. As she prepared to sit back down at the keyboard for the final time, she realized something profound. She had spent her life trying to compensate for what she lacked. She had tried to memorize the world through other people's descriptions. But music was not about compensation. It was about truth. And the truth was, she didn't need eyes to see the beauty of the world. She only needed to feel it, and then let her fingers speak that feeling to others. She had made the audience see everything without using their eyes at all. She had shown them the colors of the soul. The applause finally began to fade, settling back into a rhythmic clapping, demanding more. The conductor raised his baton again. She took her seat, wiped her hands quickly on her dress, and placed her fingers on the cool ivory. She was ready. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, glowing confidence. She was not just a musician anymore. She was a storyteller, and the world was finally listening.